Bitcoin, I'm just gonna read your tweet from last night, okay? You said, lots of wild bulls continue to go nuts, but ultimately the 65K confirming is the level. That is the end all be all level per past cycles. Be careful as this hype is based on the Bitcoin futures ETF debuting. So far, 65K not taken out. Let's watch the price action into next week. So, bit of background info for the folks watching right now. You have come on the show before. You've called for 20K Bitcoin. You have said that until Bitcoin confirms its past all-time high of 66K, we could still reach lower levels, 20K for example. It's hitting resistance at 60K, not yet at 65. What's happening right now?
So right now you do have this ETF like craze, right? So we have the futures ETF that's going to debut. I think it's on Tuesday this coming week, and that's creating so much hype in the retail sector that it has driven Bitcoin tremendously higher. My fear is that you're starting to set up some sort of sell the news event. In fact, when we saw the futures initially debut on Bitcoin, that actually was a sell the news event. And I do wonder if the institutions and the big money is kind of setting up the investor for this downdraft. And if you look at past cycles in Bitcoin, and this is what the big disagreement is the cycle we're in, has the top been at 65K, or is this just a stepping stone to a much higher cycle top? We don't know that as a technical trader until we take out 65,000. So that's really what I'm watching, and we are close now. I mean, we probably will know in the next week. It's interesting, it's going to coincide with the Bitcoin ETF.
I do want to follow up on the technicals in just a minute, but let's talk about this ETF and this hype. I don't understand this hype. Help me out. If you want to buy Bitcoin, you already can buy Bitcoin. So who is this going to affect, really? I mean, the ETF, we're going to see obviously an inflow of capital, but where is that inflow coming from or going to come from?
Well, the hope is that it's more from the retail investor, not necessarily the young investors that are already on Coinbase and stuff, but I'm thinking more like, you have a 60-year-olds who would never normally open up a Coinbase account or a Kraken account. The hope is that they're going to say, okay, it's now an ETF, I can now invest in Bitcoin.
Okay, but let's walk through the practicality of this hype. So if you're a 60-year-old, 65-year-old retiree, and you haven't invested in Bitcoin already, you're saying this ETF is going to make the entire difference? That's the tipping point for people who are skeptical about buying Bitcoin? Does that really make sense to you?
It doesn't make sense to me, but that is what the narrative is. And you have to be careful with narratives. And I want people to understand this. When you had all the kind of the Reddit crowd, the Wall Street Bets crowds, initially that was based off the small investor. I do worry that the institutions and hedge funds have gotten involved and have spun narratives to try to get the price to go up. And I do worry that that's what happened. That's what has happened here over the last 3 weeks or so. That the institutions are hyping this as a change. They're getting on these boards under super secret screen names, and they're pumping this type of thing.
So would you use the word overhyped to describe this phenomenon, this ETF craze that we're seeing right now?
I would, and I would also caution investors to understand that future ETFs based on futures always go to zero over the long term. So be really careful.
What goes to zero?
So the way a futures ETF is done is that it's based on future contracts. Right? There's a contract rollover with Bitcoin, and let's just say you have a $10 price. And if the rollover future contango signals that you have higher prices on future months out. So if you have to roll over those contracts, you might sell at 10 the current month and buy at 11 for the future month, the next month. Overall, you're losing a percentage every time you roll over. Eventually, that investor is going to lose. It's just going to drive Bitcoin down, even if Bitcoin doesn't necessarily go down.
Would you buy a Bitcoin ETF?
Not based on the futures, I wouldn't. Now, listen, I'm a shorter term trader, you know that. For short-term moves, the Bitcoin ETF based on futures, absolutely, you could play it, and I will play it as a trader, but I wouldn't buy it as a long-term hold in any investment account.
All right. The Bitcoin ETF, you wouldn't buy that. Would you buy the underlying, I almost called it a commodity.
Yeah.
The currency, whatever you want to call it. Would you buy Bitcoin right now, $60,000? Would you touch it at current levels?
No, and in fact, I've actually thought about shorting it up here. I haven't been short, even though I'm calling for 20,000 because I've been very nervous about Bitcoin, but I actually would consider testing a short out right underneath 65,000 or near 65,000, and then if price confirms above, I would just exit for a small loss. But the downside risk here is actually pretty impressive for me in terms of technicals as well as momentum and hype.
I'm going to go back to your previous tweet. So right now we're barely breaching 60,000. We're struggling to breach that level. But you made the case for 65,000. That's the key level for you.
Yeah.
Once it hits 65, would you change your mind? Would you say, okay, this is the critical support or resistance level rather that has already been breached. Now it looks like bullish momentum is here. I should start getting long. Would you make that argument?
So the way a trader would trade this is if it breaches 65,000, it no longer can be compared to past cycles, and you have to assume there is further upside. As a trader, I would never chase something that's gone straight from 40 to 65,000. What I would do though is then instead of waiting for it to go to 18 to 20, I would buy on pullbacks at that point. So let's say it breaches 65 and confirms. Let's say it pulls back to 50 or 40, then I buy instead of waiting for 18 to 20. Absolutely.
I'm impressed by how disciplined you are. I mean, 60 to 65K is not that big of a difference. One might just say, well, why don't you just carry that assumption over to current levels?
Well, so the 65,000 level is really the big kahuna, right? I mean, that's the previous cycle, that's the cycle high from April. That's what means in a technical trading perspective, that's everything. If it can't breach that, then you still have lower highs in the chart.
Okay. All right, let's talk about one more thing on the Bitcoin futures. So you're suggesting that the retail investors are going to be affected more than the institutional investors by the ETFs. Is it going to be easier for a retail investor to purchase a Bitcoin ETF versus starting a wallet and accumulating Bitcoins using just traditional methods?
I do think so, just because it's less scary. So you still have a lot of investors out there that are very skeptical on opening a crypto account. We always hear about people getting, their funds stolen from cryptocurrency accounts. If you can now purchase it in your investment portfolio, I think that gives a lot of people that were hesitant the reason or an incentive to buy Bitcoin, the Bitcoin ETF.
And transaction fees, would there be a difference between transaction fees in the Bitcoin ETFs versus just regular Bitcoin?
Well, I assume, so I'm not sure what they'll charge in terms of the ETF fees, but I would assume that you would pay basically your fee on a stock trade, your commission. So, you go to Coinbase, you can pay like hundreds of dollars for a buy and a sell in terms of a commission. You might only pay $5 or even free to some people for the ETF, so that'll be interesting too.